Good morning, everyone. So in my talk, what I'm going to do, I'm going to briefly share some of the research that I've been doing in collaboration with a whole host of collaborators, postgrad students, and international collaborators on the secondary transfer effect of intergroup contact. You've all done such a fantastic job over the past 2 days laying the groundwork for my presentation that in terms of covering some of the factors associated with the relationship between contact and prejudice, that I'm not going to go into that so much. I won't be covering that. I'm just going to focus on the broader generalization of the benefits of intergroup contact, specifically within the context of post-conflict societies where intergroup contacts may still be limited. So how can you achieve those generalizations in those contexts? Right, so on Saturday, last Saturday, 27th of April, South Africa celebrated its 25th year post-apartheid democracy. And in spite of the progress that we've made as a post-conflict society, we continue to face numerous challenges to forging positive intergroup relations. Some of these challenges have to do with the spatial legacies of apartheid. So if you look at this map of the Cape Town metropole, you can see that neighborhoods remain largely homogeneous and segregated. So the red areas that you see there describe neighborhoods comprising Black African South Africans. The green areas describe neighborhoods comprising colored South Africans. And for those of you who aren't familiar with South Africa's different population groups, colored South Africans are South Africans of mixed racial heritage. The blue areas are white neighborhoods, and the very small yellow area that you can see there in the middle comprises neighborhoods where South Africans of Indian or Asian descent are living. So what you can see there is that we find numerous instances in the picture next door of great socioeconomic inequality living side by side. And in spite of this proximity, intergroup contact among South Africans remains limited. So national samples, research amongst national samples show that 62% of South Africans find it difficult to interact with members of the outgroup, while 21% of respondents reports not trusting members of the outgroup. And even though 33% of South Africans report often or always talking with outgroupers, it appears that these interactions are quite casual and superficial, given that 52% of South Africans report never socializing with outgroupers. So it's against this backdrop of limited intergroup contact and sustained negative outgroup evaluations that I think it's especially important to explore ways of maximizing the impact of intergroup contact when it does in fact occur. So in 2009, Tom Pettigrew wrote about the so-called secondary transfer effect of contact that could potentially offer a means of achieving this very goal. And as he described it, the secondary transfer effect occurs when the decreased prejudice from contact with one outgroup extends to another outgroup not involved in this contact, or an outgroup that is infrequently encountered. Now, there's been a substantial body of research that has emerged to support the secondary transfer effect, but time doesn't allow me to review that. So I'm just going to move right along and look at and share with you some of the research that I've been doing. So I'm going to share 3 studies with you. In the first study, we used the 3-wave longitudinal experimental design to explore the secondary transfer effect for direct and extended contact, as well as to explore the secondary transfer effect of attitudes and trust. In the second study, we use a cross-sectional design to explore alternative mediators of the secondary transfer effect, namely empathy and intergroup anxiety generalization. And in the third study, we look at the moderation of the secondary transfer effect as a function of group status. So in study 1, the key question here was whether experimentally manipulated direct and extended contact with Black South African Confederates would promote more positive attitudes and greater trust towards Black South Africans in general. So in other words, the basic contact effect, and whether these contact effects would generalize to include more positive attitudes towards Indian South Africans. Now, we undertook this research amongst white South Africans here at Stellenbosch University, and we chose these two outgroups quite purposefully. Black South Africans constitute a substantial minority at Stellenbosch University, whereas Indian South Africans are just a handful of students. They comprise a couple of hundred students in a student body approaching 30,000. So we recruited female friends, white female friends, in their friendship pairs, 21 experimental pairs of white female friends, and we had 8 pairs of white female friends included in the control. All participants completed an online survey at time 1, and this online survey included measures of prior contact with and attitudes and trust towards both Black South Africans and Indian South Africans. And this would serve as a baseline against which we would measure any potential changes. So at time 2, 1 week later, the control participants would come in and complete another online survey relating to their attitudes and trust towards Black and Indian South Africans. And the experimental pairs would come in and they would participate in a closeness induction task, after which they would then complete an online survey. Now, these experimental pairs were randomly divided up into 2 conditions. One friend, or one half of the friendship pair, was assigned to the direct contact condition, the other half to the extended contact condition. And the participants in the direct contact condition would engage in the closeness induction task with a female Black South African Confederate. And this closeness induction task comprised a series of predetermined questions, which enabled them to get to know one another a little better. And they would take turns asking each other these questions. And the participant in the extended contact condition would sit in another room and watch and listen in on this conversation through a closed circuit television. After the task was completed, all the participants would then complete another online survey relating to task success, how they experienced the Confederates, as well as their general attitudes and trust towards Black South Africans and Indians. Finally, at time 3, all participants again completed a final battery of questions relating to their attitudes and trust towards Black South Africans. So what do we find? If we look at changes in attitudes towards Black South Africans across the 3 conditions between time 1 and time 2, then what we find is that only participants in the direct contact condition experienced a significant improvement in their attitudes towards Black South Africans in general. This is Cohen's D. And although their scores dropped at time 3, the difference between their time 3 attitude score towards Black South Africans and time 1 approached significance. Now, if we look at trust, the pattern of results is slightly different. So participants in the direct contact condition experienced a significant improvement in trust over time between time 1 and time 2, but these gains could not be maintained by time 3, where there was a significant decrease in trust again towards Black South Africans as the scores dropped down to baseline. And this suggests that it might be easier to maintain the gains in positive attitudes towards an outgroup than it is to maintain gains in outgroup trust. So then what we did is we wanted to explore whether a positive change in attitudes towards Black South Africans between time 1 and time 2 would predict more positive attitudes towards Indian South Africans at time 2, while controlling for baseline attitudes towards Indians at time 1. So we created a dummy variable for condition to test this and found a significant positive relationship between condition, control, control extended and direct, and change in attitudes towards Black South Africans over time, which then predicted more positive attitudes towards Indians at time 2. So this exhibits the classic secondary transfer effect. Unfortunately, we weren't able to observe this for trust. So we found the secondary transfer effect again for outgroup attitudes towards Black South Africans, promoting more positive attitudes towards Indian South Africans, but the same did not hold true for trust. So in summary, for study 1, we observe a stronger generalization effect for direct contact relative to extended contact, and this is perhaps not so surprising. And we observe the generalization of positive attitudes, but not trust. So in study 2, we had 2 samples of white South African students, and we explored whether greater empathy towards a primary outgroup would generalize to include greater empathy towards a secondary outgroup. And similarly, whether a reduction in intergroup anxiety towards the primary outgroup would predict a reduction in intergroup anxiety towards a secondary outgroup. So when we tested for empathy generalization, we measured cross-group friendships with Black South Africans as the primary outgroup and general contact with colored South Africans as the secondary outgroup. Now, just to be clear, you might be wondering, how did we decide which one was the primary outgroup and which one was the secondary outgroup? We used Tom's rather strict definition that the primary outgroup is the group that you have more encounters with or are more likely to interact with. So we did group comparisons to see who are these particular participants having more cross-group friendships with, which we saw as more intimate contact. And in this sample, they were having more cross-group friendships with Black South Africans and colored South Africans, hence Black South Africans were the primary outgroup. To overcome the threat of shared method variance, we measured different dimensions of empathic responding for each outgroup, as well as different types of outgroup attitudes for each outgroup. So as predicted by the contact hypothesis, positive contact was associated with outgroup attitudes in the anticipated direction for both the primary and secondary outgroup. And we also observed a secondary transfer effect via attitude generalization. So as shown in the contact literature for each outgroup, the measures of empathic responding significantly mediated this relationship between contact and attitudes, but we also observed evidence supporting the empathy generalization hypothesis. Increased perspective taken towards Black South Africans predicted increased empathy towards colored South Africans. All the indirect relationships that you observe here were significant. So when testing for anxiety generalization amongst a new sample of white South African students, we used identical measures of contact, as we did when we explored empathy generalization. We measured intergroup anxiety towards Black South Africans, and then we measured a related but sufficiently distinct construct of negative outcome expectancies towards colored South Africans to test for potential anxiety generalization. So again, we find a similar pattern of results where contact predicts improved attitudes towards each respective group, and we observe attitude generalization. As reported in the contact literature, the measures of our proxy measures of anxiety significantly mediated the relationship between contact and prejudice for each outgroup. And then we observed a significant generalization of anxiety, such that greater anxiety towards Black South Africans predicted more negative expectancies towards colored South Africans, and vice versa in terms of the reduction of intergroup anxiety and reductions in negative expectancies. So in study 2, we observe evidence that supports the operation of the secondary transfer effect via both empathy generalization and anxiety generalization. In study 3, we explored the moderation of the secondary transfer effect by perceived outgroup similarity. So what we find is the secondary transfer effect for white participants. Here we've got the primary outgroup is friendships with colored South Africans, and the secondary outgroup is friendship with black South Africans. And when we decompose this secondary transfer effect, this attitude generalization, we see that it only operates for the sample under conditions of high perceived similarity between coloreds and blacks. But for the black sample, where the primary outgroup is white and the secondary outgroup is colored, we don't observe any secondary transfer effect. And this we found kind of strange because whites and coloreds do share some socio-historical and socio-cultural similarities in the South African context. So one would expect there to be some perception of similarities, especially at Stellenbosch University, between white and colored students. So to conclude, we're putting more pieces of the puzzle together for the secondary transfer effect, understanding when, why, and how the secondary transfer effect might operate. Importantly, this research highlights new pathways for achieving generalized prejudice reduction through either direct or extended contact and via attitude, empathy, and/or anxiety generalization. And I think that this is especially useful to have such a broad array of pathways for achieving generalized prejudice reduction in post-conflict societies. However, the research cautions that not all outcomes are equally achievable. So we found attitude generalization, but not trust generalization, and this needs to be explored further. And these results also leave a number of unanswered questions. Why do some outcomes appear easier to generalize than others? How can one enhance the ability of extended contact to encourage greater generalization? We also need to understand the moderation of the secondary transfer effect for different groups and different group combinations better. And then obviously there are important methodological shortcomings associated with this research. So we need more research to get a clear picture of what's going on. Thanks to my collaborators, and thank you again to the organizers for making this possible. Thank you for your attention. Greetings from Stellenbosch. Thanks.
Yeah, great talk. Many thanks. Many nice pictures. I think we have time for one or two quick questions.
Thank you. This was a great talk. I really enjoyed it. I would like you to speculate. Why do you think does the secondary effect on trust does not, why doesn't it maintain until over time? And why don't we see it for the secondary transfer versus a positive attitude? What could be the mechanism behind that?
So that's a fantastic question. And really that's the central question relating to these different outcomes. Trust, as we know, it's hard to achieve trust. It takes multiple acts of trustworthy experiences or trustworthy behaviors to generate that trust. So the closeness induction task in and of itself may have encouraged some amount of trust immediately post-task, but without any follow-up experiences with Black South Africans that can further boost that trust, those initial feelings of trust towards the outgroup, we reckon, would dissipate quicker. Whereas with attitudes, it's a lot easier to change your attitude towards something and then to maintain that. It doesn't seem to involve, or it doesn't seem to take much from you or demand much of you to maintain a positive attitude towards something than it is to make yourself vulnerable and trust something on the basis of just one experience. So I think that's part of the explanation, but we need to delve deeper into that to get more clarity. Thank you. Good question.
Okay, Hermann, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you. Cheers.